Que pasa? As the poet laureate of my generation, George Carlin, once said, Que what you call your pasa. Welcome to another edition of the Intelligent Comic Book Investor. My name is Vince, aka Really Bad Comic Books. And today we're going to be talking about investing in historically relevant comic books, whether it's a good idea, whether it's not. So let's get into it. But to start, I really need to give you some context into like where I'm coming from on this. I grew up in the home of a Catholic, Irish Catholic, and Democratic family, basically. So on the wall of my home, you would see two photos: the Pope and John F. Kennedy. So what happened was that I grew up in a very close knit, tight family, and because I was the youngest of six, I was heavily influenced by my brothers. I inherited three things from my brother: a love of comic books. So I had all the Silver Age keys from a Marvel perspective. I'm talking like Fantastic Four 1, early Avengers, early Spider-Man, early Hulk. I remember reading in the back seat of a car, on a little road trip that I was going on. I remember reading like Avengers 10. And I remember feeling when I was reading this, like I was so lucky. Like I felt blessed to have this comic book. I didn't know, that it would become like, it, relevant from a collecting perspective. That wasn't important to me, but I just remember the story. And I remember just loving the story, and I felt so blessed and honored to get it, to be able to read it. Like I remember that in my moment when I read it, feeling that way. I also inherited from my brothers a love of history. Before I had my current career as a technology sales guy, I majored in history, and I had designs on becoming a history professor, history teacher, like my two older brothers, two of my three older brothers. And then they also gave me this love of board games, which I still love today. To me, a board game isn't really worth playing unless you can sit down for 8 hours and play it, which is, if you play board games at all, you may have heard of a game called Twilight Imperium. That's my jam. I play the shit out of that game. But in general, I play the shit out of board games too. So I inherited these three things from my brother. Now, today we're going to talk about how history and comic books collide and whether or not these are good investments. So let's get started. Let's talk about why historical comic books are significant. So in 1954, a man by the name of Dr. Fredric Wertham, he published a book called Seduction of the Innocent. Now, he argued that horror and crime comics were corrupting American kids and driving juvenile delinquency. Now, he felt that, like, he was the type of person, as a psychiatrist, who felt like unless you legislate against what you believe is either right or wrong, people are going to take that as as you are encouraging it. If you don't legislate against something, it's as if you were encouraging it. And he looked, that's why he looked at comic books and the fact kids were reading these comic books as the main source of corruption amongst juveniles. Now, his book, Seduction of the Innocent, the book came out at the same time as the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee in 1954. However, his research that he did for this book was a huge trigger for the U.S. Senate Subcommittee hearing that happened where lawmakers, like it was about juvenile delinquency, but don't get it twisted. It was about comic books. Because lawmakers put the comic book industry on trial in 1954. And the fallout was massive. I mean, it led directly to the creation of the Comics Code Authority. Now, this was not a governmental authority. This was a self-censorship body. And it gutted horror and crime comics literally almost overnight. Now, 3 collector terms, I don't know, that freaking... Anyway, 3 collector terms came out of this moment. And they're often confused. So let's define them clearly. So, SOTI books or Seduction of the Innocent books are the specific outcomes and panels, like the specific books that Wertham cited and reproduced as evidence inside the book itself. Now, the second category are the Senate books that were entered into the record or shown during the actual 1954 Senate hearings. So this is a good example of that. Crime Suspense Stories 22. This is pretty much the granddaddy of comic books of this ilk. This is the big Papa Pump of comic books that were put on trial, because literally this exists in the National Archives. It was held up, I think, by Senator Hendrickson. Could have been Kefauver, I'm not sure who. A senator held it up and asked Bill Gaines, the publisher of EC Comics, and said, "Are you saying this comic book is in good taste?" And to wit, Bill Gaines said, "Well, in the context of a horror comic, it's in very good taste." You know, he didn't help. You know, that was like not a great thing to say. But I think he threw his hands up and was like, "Man, what are we going to do here?" He probably felt that, you know, the books were stacked against him. And he showed up to testify. And, you know, they had them right where they wanted, because how do you say that's in good taste, especially in the context of the 1950s? Well, you could say, well, it's not like this is the only one. To wit, they would have said, well, that's my point. Like, what do you say to that? Not a lot. So that's the second category of the actual Senate books that were called out during the Senate hearing. And the third is something called the Dirty 2 Dozen. And this is the most specific, I would say, and most recently formalized of the 3. It's a fixed list of 24 comics, and they appeared together on a poster board during the hearings. And they were titled Representative Comic Book Covers, Crime, Horror, and Weird Variety. So there's the photograph right there. This is Senator Hendrickson, and this is James Stillwell, Code Blue Comics, who basically did all the research. I'm giving him a lot of credit. My sense is that what I know about James, he's a pretty humble man, and he would give credit to a group of people who helped him. But he spearheaded it. And he's got a friend named Crime City Comics, Jason, who seems to be a huge supporter of his effort, of James' effort, and the efforts in general for people who like are really into like this era of comic books. So anyway, there it is right there. There's the image. And these 24 books are referred to as the Dirty 2 Dozen. And Code Blue, aka James, tracked down the original photograph, this photograph right here, identified all 24 issues, and he assembled, I'm going to guess, the first complete run of the set. I don't know that to be the case, but I assume it was. And inspired others to want to complete the set as well. To the point that this year, in 2026, CGC created a dedicated Dirty 2 Dozen custom label for these exact 24 books. I've got 2 of them on the wall behind me. And in, honestly, a very generous fashion, if you have one of these books that you want to grade and encapsulate, it'll be free to you to do it because James paid for it. James paid so that you could have a free custom label on any book you encapsulate that happens to be one of these 24 books. Now, the list includes books like Crime Suspense Stories 20, Tales from the Crypt 42, which is also on the board, and a host of others. There's 22 others. They were all published around between 1953 and 1954, right before the code shut this kind of storytelling down. And they after talking with James this week, apparently they just went down to the local newsstand and bought 24 of these books and just put them up on this, on this easel, on this wall, and took a photograph of it. Now, why is this interesting? I'll tell you why. Because it's a huge collecting niche, because it's not about superhero first. I would say it's about cover appeal. And it has grown into the artists who made these covers. But more than that, it's about owning a physical artifact from a First Amendment fight that literally reshaped an entire industry. Now, I want to talk more about like these as investments, but first of all, I want to talk a little bit about Fredric Wertham, the guy who wrote this book. So, because it's worth, I think, understanding the man at the center of this without turning him into a cartoon villain or a hero. Fredric Wertham was a complex, real, credentialed psychiatrist. German-American, who was born in 1895. He had a legitimate career. To his credit, he ran a low-cost mental health clinic in Harlem serving Black communities that had little to no access to psychiatric care. He asked them to pay a quarter because he believed that, you had to pay something to get some value out of it. So it wasn't actually given away for free, but if you had a quarter, you could get real psychiatric help on issues that you were challenged by. And the work that he did was actually cited in Brown versus Board of Education. This was the Supreme Court case that ended school segregation. And That's a serious, credible piece of his legacy. Now, his work on comic books, in my opinion, is a different story. Because in the book, Seduction of the Innocent, Wertham argued comics caused delinquency. And because the government did not legislate against these comics, he saw the government as making it acceptable, pervasive, almost encouraging you to read these comics. And he wanted to take a stand. Now, years later, decades later, when Wertham's original research files became available to scholars, and it was around 2010, comic historian Carol Tilly discovered that he had manipulated and in some case fabricated clinical evidence he presented as scientific proof. So the comic book side of his legacy has been substantially discredited by the later research, even though the panic he sparked was very real and had real, very real consequences for the industry. Immediately, artists were out of work, or they were so scarred by it that they just didn't want to work in comic books anymore. That's why the hearings and the censorship that Wertham triggered, they're permanent. And it's well documented history now. And these physical comics tied to that moment, they carry weight with collectors. Because it's not about the comic book. It's about the moment in history that the comic book represents. There's no first appearance of the Green Goblin in these books. It's not about first appearances at all. It is about artistry. Johnny Craig in Crime Suspense Stories 22. But it's also about the fact that a United States senator, held it up and used it as evidence in a Senate subcommittee to say juveniles are affected by this work. Now, let's talk about historical documents as a benchmark, for what we're talking about here. Historical documents are a huge category of collecting and investing. So we're going to zoom out to the broader category of historical comics that are trying to sit alongside what I would consider to be historical documents. Now, here's what the top of that market actually looks like. A rare surviving copy of the United States Constitution sold at auction for $43 million. A world record for a historical document. And only one of 11 known copies from the original 1787 printing. Talk about rare. A privately held copy of the Magna Carta dating to 1297 sold for $21.3 million at Sotheby's in 2007. And a Declaration of Independence printed by John Dunlap on the night of July 4th, the 5th, 1776, one of the earliest printed copies in existence, sold for $8.14 million. A later, rarer parchment engraving version sold for around 4.4 million. Now that's like at the top end. But let's take a look at something here. This is a heritage auction these are going to be sold and go to auction on July 30th. And it's an auction of Abraham Lincoln documents. So here you have like a manuscript fair copy of a now lost handbill that's in Lincoln's handwriting. Here's an Abraham Lincoln land grant issued under Martin Van Buren that has his writing on it. Here's his autograph. The reason why and look at the bids on these. I consider all of this stuff very affordable. If you want something of provenance from Abraham Lincoln, this is huge. Huge. $500. Here's another $500. Letter signed. To Lincoln. 1846. My point is that these documents carry real provenance. And as a result, you can trust them. You can trust them as being historical and significant and surrounding one of the greatest men in American history. People want to own that stuff. Now, if we look at it, like these historical documents, when they're tied to specific, like well-documented historical moment with real provenance, real scarcity, these can appreciate into some of the highest prices in the entire collectibles world. The U.S. Constitution, obviously, that's not going to go for a few $100s. But that's the model that these SOTI books, these Senate books, and these Dirty 2 Dozen books are following on a much smaller scale. Because, like I said, it's not about the object. It's about the moment in history the object was present for. So, are these comics a good investment? 3 reasons why it could be. It's a closed, documented universe. Let's use the Dirty 2 Dozen as an example. It's a fixed list of exactly 24 books tied to one photograph and one hearing. SOTI books are the specific issues Wertham cited as evidence in his book. And Crime Suspense Stories 22, it was specifically lifted and shown in the middle of the subcommittee and asked point blank to the publisher of that book, is this book in good taste? There's no ambiguity about does it count? Unlike endless key issue debates in modern comics, aka what's the first appearance of Wolverine? What's the first appearance of Gambit? You don't have those debates in these books. So you've got this closed, documented universe. 2, these books are very scarce. 2 of them, the Justice Traps the Guilty books and the Dirty 2 Dozen, practically ghosts. But they have real provenance because these books survived public comic burnings and parental disposal, like right after the hearings, on top of the normal 1950s regular attrition for these books. High-grade survivors are rare, and typically you'll only find high-grade survivors if they're file copies. Copies that were taken right off the production line and set aside and weren't sent to the public. They didn't have, teenage hands rummaging all over the books, just trying to read. They were set aside. And that makes them rare. And the historical link, whether it's like the congressional record, a traceable photograph, you can't fake that. You've tied it to history. So, extreme scarcity with real provenance is the second thing. The third thing, you've got real momentum now. Because CGC just launched the Dirty 2 Dozen label this year, and you've got new recognition for this stuff. I when I attend online auctions or even real claim sales or going to conventions, everyone's asking about the Dirty 2 Dozen. It's like this label has made it like the absolute Batman of pre-code horror. And it comes right before demand and awareness start climbing, the same way like a museum exhibit or documentary or a TV series announcement of absolute Batman. It can change the category literally overnight. That's something that is a real consequence to these books. Now, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why you should be cautious. First of all, there's a thin, I would say, an illiquid market. There's a small population of these books, but right now there's just a kind of a small pool of buyers. But the demand for the books is eclipsing supply. There's not a lot of these books. Now, unlike blue chip superhero keys that trade constantly, these can sit a bit before the right buyer shows up. But I mean, when the right buyer shows up, they're gone. I'm not saying it's a bad investment, but it's something you need to be wary of. There's also, as a result of the illiquid market, there's niche demand. The buyer base, these comic collectors, censorship history buffs, EC horror fans, like they're real but small next to somebody who wants to buy, Fantastic Four #5 in the context of Doctor Doom starring in his own movie very soon. Now the problem is that there are more of those books. But the thing about it is that because the demand is higher now than it used to be, the prices of these books are growing. But it's lumpier. You know what I mean? Like they come in like clumps. Like that's what I consider myself a comic book investor. And so as a result, I look for these kind of things. And I know that there's risk involved with these. However, I believe, because of what we talked about in the context of historical documents are highly collectible, now we've got comic books that are historical documents. The other thing, too, and why you should be cautious, is this like newly manufactured kind of hype. You know, the CGC label and the renewed like attention that these books are getting, like they're literally it's brand new in 2026. You can't look at any kind of recent price history. You know, which is why you see a lot of these books just go to auction, because they're like, I don't know what to charge for this fucking thing. You know, and it's unclear if this is the start of like durable demand, or is it a short-term spike? I don't think it's a short-term spike, which is why I invest in these things. Like, I'm giving you what to be cautious of, but for me, I'm willing to take the risk. I would say this is my main category of investing, are these kind of historically relevant pre-code horror crime books. Because I do think the demand is high, the supply is low, and I do believe that the investment power of these books are going to grow. Now, having said that, I'm a genuine history buff. My two brothers were history teachers. You know, I am predisposed. I grew up loving comic books and loving history, and I grew up like predisposed to love this category. So, someone who's into like censorship history, free speech, you know, and then there's people who are into EC comics and also Golden Age crime and horror. This isn't a reasonable investment. And I will say, even today, relatively affordable, in that many of them don't exist in high grade, so they're in the low grade. So it means that they're 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 easier to acquire. They're well documented, you know, and you can easily explain why you're collecting it. It's like, and people, I think in general, are like, you know, to round up my collection, I would probably like one of these books. As a pure investment play, I do think it's a little higher risk. You know, it could be illiquid, could be pretty thinly traded, could be dependent upon interest, you know, and there's some hype around this given the new label. You know, it's you know, it's so much easier though to say, you know, there's the first appearance of Green Goblin, you know, first appearance of Poison Ivy, you know, first appearance of, you know, Catwoman. You know, those are, you can consider those to be like core like investments as far as comic books are concerned. It's not really well established that this should be a core investment position. And so, but yet I'm still doing it. You know what I mean? It's, I'm entering into this with my eyes wide open. And which is why I make like this wall behind me. You can tell this is not just dollars and cents to me. There's a passion around this. I'm working on a project that I really don't want to talk about right now, but it's centered around these books. Listen, You do what you want. But personally, I love this category. I am grateful to James and whoever else helped him, if anybody helped him. It may just be him. I am just grateful that he has helped shine the light on at least this category of of these historically relevant books. You know, because we had the list from that were, you know, in SOTI, and CGC cites them, you know, used in SOTI. That's a category they use. And then there's used in the US Senate subcommittee. You know, like Panic One over there. They'll list that when you grade it. Same with Crime Suspense Stories 22. But now with the Dirty 2 Dozen, it's a new category. And who knows? Maybe in the future there's going to be more provenance, more categories for these historically relevant type of books. And the collecting will continue. And I like it also because I think it will stand the test of time. You know, it's like it's not dependent upon an MCU movie coming out. It's dependent upon history. And that's why I think it's relevant. That's why I think people will collect it. Because it is a part of our history in both good and bad ways. Folks, I hope you had a good time listening to this. If you have any questions, let me know. I want to know what you think. You know, post in the comments down below. Do you think historically relevant comic books should it be a prime category of collecting, and why? Or would you advise against collecting these type of books if you're focused on investment? What would you choose? I want to know. And until then, until I read your comments, until I come up with another video of my own, have a safe one. I want to see you back here listening to me blather on, waxing poetic about my love for comic books and my love for comic book investing. But until then, cheers.